It's August 6th, 2025, and there is a huge update about our current tropical activity. And here is our tropical weather outlook from the National Hurricane Center. And immediately we can see Tropical Storm Dexter. This is still expected to travel out towards the Atlantic, but our area of interest right off the coast of the Carolinas and Georgia has actually been upgraded to a 40% risk. And also the area of potential development has also been increased. And our area of interest out in the main development region continues to march west, and it has also been increased in probability up to 50%. But interestingly, both of these storms are actually not currently expected to impact the United States directly. And here are our European model ensembles, and immediately we can see that our interest out in the main development region is actually just expected to sort of curve back into the Atlantic Ocean as we go later into the week. Then also our interest right off the coast of the Carolinas does actually have a decent amount of confidence in development, but it also looks like it could just kind of get sucked out into the Atlantic as well, and it wouldn't really impact the United States directly except for some potential rip currents. So this is all very good news, and actually there is quite a bit of model agreement about both of these trends, but we still are about a week out from really seeing any potential impacts with these. So definitely still watch this as we get closer and when they actually develop into tropical depressions and tropical storms. And on top of our tropical activity, we actually have a risk of severe weather today out here in the northern and central plains. And this is mostly going to be fueled by the threat of some damaging winds. We do have a conditional risk for some damaging winds in the northern part of our marginal risk area, then the rest of our marginal risk area also has that conditional threat. And our risk of seeing some hail actually covers our entire marginal risk area. This is just for the conditional threat of some hail in excess of 1 inch in diameter. However, I do think we could possibly see some larger hail out here in more western parts of our risk area, even up to 2 inches in diameter. And there is actually going to be a threat of flash flooding today, with the greatest risk of that being down here in the southeast. Once again, when in the slight risk area, we could see anywhere between 2 to 4 inches of rain today. Then it is surrounded by an associated marginal risk, and there's also a marginal risk up in the northern and central plains. And in both of our marginal risk, there's just the conditional threat of 1 to 2 inches of rainfall also. And unfortunately, the cooling trend that we've seen for the past week is about to be replaced by another warming trend. Unfortunately, we're going to see the same areas that we've been seeing, Texas and the Gulf Coast, still experiencing some high 90s to low 100s feels like temperatures, but unfortunately the Great Plains are going to get their first taste of some low 100s temperatures in a bit. As we go further into the afternoon, it's actually going to warm up quite a bit there, even up into possibly the 102 to 105 feels like temperatures territory. And here's what the radar could look like later today. We're going to see that we have a remnant mesoscale convective vortex from yesterday's storms pushing through Iowa. This would bring the conditional threat for mostly some damaging winds, and then back along some outflow left behind from yesterday's storms, and also a cold front and potentially a short wave pushing through the area. We could actually see some initiation of a cluster of supercells back here in South Dakota and Nebraska around the late evening hours. Now, these could actually potentially produce some 2 to even 3 inch hail and some 65 to 75 or hurricane force gusts, because the environment out here is actually going to be very favorable for them to do that. However, the initiation of these storms is actually very conditional currently, and there's actually some conflict on if this will actually happen due to the lack of forcing out here. However, I do think there's a decent chance that we do see a solution like this come true fruition, but definitely if you're out here in parts of southern South Dakota and parts of northern Nebraska, stay weather aware today. And our last area that we're looking at is going to be a small sliver up here in northern Minnesota. This would potentially be initiated by the low-level jet and some synoptic forcing from above, but the initiation of these storms are also pretty conditional, because there's not going to be a lot of forcing out here today, and there's going to be a lot of flow over top, which actually hinders the lift out here for these storms. So another area where confidence in seeing storms isn't 100% and set in stone, but definitely the possibility of storms out here is still decently large. And this is actually a cluster which could produce all hazards of severe weather today. if it were to form. And here are 500 millibar winds. This gives us a better picture of where we're going to see some forcing and hindrance for our storms today. Immediately, we're going to see a bit of a shortwave pushing through Iowa, helping to sustain that mesoscale convective vortex from yesterday's storms. We're also going to look for a bit of a shortwave pushing through into parts of Nebraska, which will tag team along with a weak cold front further up in South Dakota to initiate our storms right there around the late afternoon hours. And then again, up here in our Minnesota area, we're going to notice that there is going to be a pretty conditional threat for storms because we're going to have quite a bit of flow right over top of that region, which actually hinders the lift in that area. But we're going to notice a short wave pushing through in parts of Canada. Now, the timing of this is going to be really critical, but it does appear that it could eject just in time to coincide with that low-level jet to potentially initiate some storms, bringing all hazards of severe weather today. And here is a look at our environment out in Iowa in front of that mesoscale convective system. We actually do see some curvature on our photograph, some nice low-level shear, and even a decent amount of surface helicity. So I do think there could potentially be the conditional threat for a couple of weak, isolated spin-up tornadoes with this system, although it's going to be pretty conditional because the convection is supposed to be pretty messy and not really organized at all. And one of the reasons it's not going to be organized is the lack of organizing shear. But however, there is some weak wind veering, so we could potentially see that, and the cloud bases will be low enough for that threat to be pretty conditional. And we're actually going to see a pretty moist air mass, 70 dew point. That's actually very moist. And then we're also going to see a modestly to pretty unstable environment at around 25 to 3,000 Cape. So just favorable for severe weather today in Iowa in front of these storms. So I do think we could potentially see the conditional threat for a weak spin up tornado and not really see some hail in excess of 1 inch in diameter, but I do think we also could see some 60-mile-an-hour damaging gust as well. Now, moving to our cluster of supercells in southern South Dakota and northern Nebraska, we're actually going to notice that our environment out here is going to be pretty conducive for some pretty significant severe weather, mostly being hail and damaging winds. We have a straight photograph, quite a bit of organizing shear at around 31 knots, so definitely enough for some organized storms, and coupled that with some wind veering, our cloud base would be low enough to support a tornado threat. So although our shear and helicity is actually going to be pretty low, we do have a decent bit of 3 Cape, and we have so much Cape out here. It's actually expected to be extremely unstable in the ballpark of anywhere between 4,500 to 6,000 Cape. And when there's this much Cape, and because these storms could potentially be near an outflow boundary and also potentially on a cold front, I would say there is the very conditional threat for possibly a tornado, although that threat is very slim. And these storms would mostly be damaging wind and large hail producers. One of the reasons for that large hail is going to be the abundance of Cape up here near the freezing level and the very, very high mid-level lapse rates, 9.2 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. And these storms are also expected to be discrete on top of that, which further fosters that threat for some large hail. So I wouldn't be surprised to even see over 2-inch in diameter hail, even up to potentially 3-inch hail. And then the reasons for that strong damaging wind threat is the extremely high downdraft Cape, 1900. That is super duper high. So definitely some strong damaging winds if we do actually get those storms out here. We also see a decently low relative humidity, which can help with evaporative cooling and sinking air. Then we also see some dry air aloft, which kind of does the same thing. And another thing is that it's going to be very moist out here, 72 dew point. Now, one of the things that could actually hinder our storms out here and actually not really make them occur at all, it's going to be a bit of a warm nose or capping inversion at around 2 kilometers in the atmosphere. And because there's going to be such weak forcing today, something as small as this could actually hinder our threat significantly. But because there's going to be so much Cape, our lapse rates are pretty high across the board. I do think if we get some forcing like we are expecting to see, I definitely think we could potentially see this cluster of significant supercells out here in that area. In our last area of interest up here in northern Minnesota, we actually do see some curvature on our photograph, some nice low-level shear and helicity, and even quite a bit of bulk shear around 31 knots. So our shear, our helicity is going to be pretty favorable. So one of the reasons why I do think all hazards of severe weather could potentially be out here. We also have a low enough cloud base and some weak wind veering. However, the main thing hindering it is going to be some stable air at the surface and how well the atmosphere can actually recover in front of those behind that line of storms from early this morning and yesterday. But because this capping inversion here doesn't look super duper large and there is expected to be some forcing all the week, I definitely do think there's the potential for a couple of storms out here in northern Minnesota. It's going to be a moist environment, a modestly unstable environment with also quite a bit of 3 Cape as well, nearing 200. So I do think we could potentially see all hazards of severe weather out here in northern Minnesota today.